before school officially started, and I don't know who was up there on the stage, but he was touting the diversity back then of their entering class. And so he'd have you stand up and he said, and we have 3 gentlemen here from the Philippines. Would you stand, please? So us 3 gringos kind of stood up. People were looking at us like, who? You're from the Philippines? Yeah. Well, yeah, technically we were. Which, leads me to a really, what I thought at the time was quite a funny story. We, in Utah at the time, that you couldn't get anything higher than a 3.2 beer. And you couldn't smoke unless you were older than 18, which you'd get tickets for if they caught you, they being the Salt Lake City police. But somehow we liberated some beer one night, and we had a guy in the dorm who had a car, so we went up to Canyon Road that evening, and we're drinking beer up there, and next thing we know, there's a cop car right behind us, and a cop gets out and says, all right, you guys, get out of the car. There was the 3 of us from the Philippines and a friend of ours whose dad was in the diplomatic corps. So he starts at one end and says, where are you from? Philippines, sir. Next kid, Philippines. Me, Philippines. And so he comes to the last kid. He says, I suppose you're from the Philippines too. And the kid says, no, sir, I'm from Saudi Arabia. So he said, guys, if you go about half a mile up the road, we don't go that far up there. So meanwhile, we had dumped the beer and everything. So that was just that was the deal in Salt Lake City.
And then at what point did you start thinking, I'm going to go to the Naval Academy instead of continuing with your career at the University of Utah?
My career at the University of Utah was fading fast, shall we say. I had joined NROTC and really enjoyed that, but the rest of academics really weren't my forte. About Christmas time, my parents were back in Newport, Rhode Island, so I caught a train back to there for Christmas, and that's when my dad and I had some serious talks about, what I was going to do. And I said, well, okay. I had to promise him that I would apply to the Naval Academy. And I wasn't, that keen on it, but, I got to keep Dad happy. Happy Dad, and he kept that $50 a month spending money coming, which typically was spent long before it arrived. So I applied to the Naval Academy, took the SAT one weekend, and did surprisingly well. And a couple of months later, I get this little envelope in the mail, and I'm thinking, gosh. Well, actually, it was a packet, I guess. It wasn't really just an envelope. And I was thinking, I was afraid to open it. My roommate said, if it was going to be, if it's a rejection letter, it's probably just a simple letter. And he said, you get a packet, you're probably in. So sure enough, I opened it up. I'd been accepted at a presidential appointment from JFK, and it went off. I had some interesting experiences as an NROTC kiddo at Utah, and one came from a senior enlisted Marine. There was a gunny, just an outstanding gent, and he couldn't do enough for you. He organized the little programs on the weekends where we go out and set up ambushes in the canyons up from Salt Lake, or up from the University of Utah, and it's really, so he kind of, I think that's where I got the idea that I wanted to be a Marine, from Gunny, whose name I can't remember. But
was he a World War II guy?
I don't think so. I think he was more of a Korean guy.
Oh, okay.
Just outstanding. He couldn't do enough for you, and he, in my speech class, I had to give a speech that used a prop, and so we had just had a class on the Thompson submachine gun. Now, you can't imagine doing it. You couldn't do this today.
No.
So I said, hey, Gunny, can I borrow the Thompson submachine gun, like on Tuesday for my speech class? It'll be gone for a couple of hours. And I had a guitar case from somebody on my floor in the dorm that I carried it in. So I'm walking across campus with this guitar case with a Thompson submachine gun. Didn't think a thing of it, back then. This was fall of 62. Got to the speech class and said, kind of set the class up. I'm here to talk about, my whatever. I forget what word I used, but my weapon here, but my device here in the case. Of course, everybody thought it was going to be a guitar. It popped out with his Thompson submachine gun. The prof nearly keels over. So I gave him a little spiel. It was very well received, I must say. I think I got an A for the speech, but he gave me a pretty good tongue lashing about bringing such a thing to a classroom. Much
probably nervous to give you any other grade.
No, probably not. But it was fun.
So how long was it between when you got your acceptance letter and when you actually showed up for plebe summer?
I showed up for plebe summer on June 26th of 1963, and I probably got my acceptance letter in March, April, something like that.
And were you mentally prepared for plebe summer?
I believe I was, yes. In fact, I had pretty much come to all stop academically at Utah when I got the acceptance letter, because they had my first semester grades, and that was all they were going to evaluate. So I kind of ditched college for the next 4 or 5 months. There was a joke I heard later in the NROTC unit was later that they joked that the way to get in the Naval Academy was to flunk out of the University of Utah. But I did okay there. I struggled with academics at the Naval Academy, but I looked at it more as a leadership laboratory, I guess.
And then, so now it's 1963, you said, when you started there?
Yeah.
Are you guys even thinking about Vietnam at this point?
No, we're not. I can't even recall, hearing about Vietnam. At Utah, that fall, we had, heard and been not part of, but, the whole deal had been about the Cuban crisis. That was all the news that fall. We followed that pretty closely, but I don't think we had heard about Vietnam at all.
Yeah, things were not really escalated there at all yet.
No, not at that time.
It's no surprise. And you were you had some pretty notable people in your Naval Academy class.
Well, this is true. I became friends early on with a fellow who, at that time, went by Larry North. He now goes by Ollie. One of my friends in the class after that was Jim Webb. He was a boxer. I was a boxer. North was a boxer. A bunch of the guys I hung up with were boxers. We had a fellow named Ray Smith, who later on became a 2-star SEAL. I believe the first one to carry 2 stars. I'm not sure about that, but good guy, captain of the track team. Had Pete Pace in the class, first Marine to ever be chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 4 stars. Pretty heavy duty company.
Yeah, and then what about was Staubach with you guys too?
Staubach was in the class of 65. He was 2 years ahead of us. But our plebe year, the first year there, was the year he won the Heisman Trophy, which, of course, argued well for plebes, because after a football game, if you won, you'd have carry-on that weekend. And if you beat Army, you got carry-on, meaning you didn't have to brace up in the halls and chop around in the halls. And you didn't have to sit on the last couple inches of your chair in the mess hall.
And I know you got another guy that have got some information on a guy by the name of Tex.
Tex Harkins, a fellow from Texas, needless to say, was my roommate plebe summer and plebe year, one of several. Met him when I first came into the room with a sea bag full of gear that I now had to stencil. He'd been there a couple of hours, and he introduced himself as Maurice. Well, I did a double take because I didn't think Maurice was going to fly, and sure enough, a couple of hours later, when I was worn out from hearing about how great things were in Texas, he became Tex. And Tex stuck. He's still Tex to this day. Good guy.
And there's some note about him trying to kill a firstie.
That wasn't Tex. That
okay.
was North. I stopped North going into this firsties room early morning when we had window closing detail in the winter. You'd have to go in and close the upper class windows. And he was headed off to this first class room with a bayonet. And he was going to do this guy in. This guy was horseshit beyond belief. I said, North, you can't do that. you'll get in serious trouble, buddy.
Yeah, you can't kill someone. You're going to get in serious trouble. Right. That's good advice right there.
Plea beer was a little different back then, I think. Not quite the same anymore.
And then, so you talked about boxing, and were you a boxer before you showed up there?
Negative. No.
You just got into it when you were there?
I was not a particularly athletic young man, but boxing was something that most of everybody started out from ground zero with no experience. So that's kind of what I did. Plebe summer and took it on to plebe year and boxed plebe year, some youngster year, which is sophomore year, and second class year, junior year. First class year, senior year, I was in academic trouble, shall we say. So I wasn't on the boxing team, but I did run the boxing sub-squad where freshmen and sophomores ended up, if they failed boxing, as part of the PT curriculum, you'd have to go to a sub-squad. This was for every sport until you could, the leader of the sub-squad passed you, so you'd get a D. Because you couldn't have an F at the Naval Academy.
Did they make you, I know guys that I know that went to Naval Academy, they made them box for a semester, they made them wrestle for a semester, they made them do judo for a semester. Did they make you guys do wrestling and judo?
We did wrestling, boxing. We had some part of the PT curriculum was mandatory. You had 2 years of boxing lessons, 2 years of wrestling, 2 years of gymnastics.
Okay.
And 4 years of swimming, and they fed in all kinds of other things, like squash and golf and track. But, first 2 years you had some mandatory things that you had to pass as part of the PT curriculum. Didn't have judo.
Well, like still, boxing and wrestling is an awesome base to have as a fighter. And then you throw judo in there, you're pretty good to go.
Yeah, we are.
And then what, I know you did some cornering for some of the guys, when they were boxing.
I did. It was my senior year, first class year, and North was in the finals, the boxing finals. You could win your Navy N, your letter, in boxing, even though it was not an intramural sport so much, but it was more of a club sport. But we didn't box against other institutions. They do now, but it was all within the brigade, and we'd have quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals. And I was in North's corner the year he won his N, boxing against another well-known Naval Academy graduate, Jim Webb, who I think you've had on your program before.
Yeah, indeed.
And shall we say it was interesting. Webb had a lot of experience boxing. He'd boxed Golden Gloves, I believe, before he came to the Naval Academy, or at least city and county type boxing, state boxing, from wherever his dad was stationed at the time. But he and North they were two folks that were butt heads, I think, their entire careers, whenever they would run into each other, certainly at the Naval Academy and certainly when they were boxing. But it was an interesting night.
So this is a legit grudge match.
I think that probably would be fair to say.
And how'd it go down?
North won, much to everybody's surprise. North was the street fighter, and Webb was a more polished boxer.
Yeah, if you boxed certainly at the Golden Gloves level, even at like the county level, you're a really good boxer.
Yeah.
So that's a big achievement.
Well, somehow there's been, people have looked backwards, and that always comes up when you start talking about North and or Webb. Was the boxing match. Everybody knew it was a.
Did it go the distance?
It did. The distance being only 3 rounds. Back then.
Yeah. Are they 2-minute rounds or 3-minute rounds? Because sometimes they have amateurs box 2-minute rounds.
I think they were 2-minute rounds. Yeah, they weren't.
So 6 minutes of fury.
Boy, I tell you, yeah. I know wrestling can wipe you out in 5-6 minutes, but we were spent when at the end of a boxing match. You were spent. All you could do to pull yourself out of the ring.
And what did you like for boxing for you, since you were new to boxing and you weren't much of an athlete before? What do you think you took away from boxing?
Well, don't quit. I went to the semifinals my junior year, got knocked